Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. This video will be covering the top monster sets for DPS in the Elder Scrolls Online. When I get questions about monster sets in ESO, people often ask, which one is the best? Just give me the one that does the most damage, and ESO doesn't really work like that. I think the devs have done a pretty good job at making many of the different options the quote-unquote best, but it's up to you to use them in the correct scenario that they would be best in. So that said, this video won't be a ranking from number 10 down to number 1, but instead we'll just be going through my favorite 10 options for DPS and hopefully giving you a better idea of when it's best to use them. And one last thing before we get started, quick shout out to ESOHub.com for all of the tooltips for the gear used in this video. Great site for all things ESO related. To start out, we'll go through some options that are a bit more useful for single target scenarios. First up, we have Kjolnar's Nightmare. This set is from Unhallowed Grave. The one piece adds 129 weapon and spell damage, and then for the two piece, damaging an enemy with a light attack puts a bone stack on them for 5 seconds, up to once every half second. Add 5 stacks. An undodgeable skeletal hand attacks your enemy after 1 second, knocking them into the air and stunning them for 3 seconds, or dealing magic damage if they cannot be stunned. Enemies then become immune to Kjolnar's Nightmare stacks for 4 seconds. The damage scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. So for PvE purposes, that stun part is not really relevant. We're using this set for the damage. Since elite enemies cannot be stunned anyways, that's the part that we'll always get. This one is top tier for pure single target damage. However, the big drawback is that the bone stacks work as a debuff on the enemy, therefore only one person in the group can really make use of this set at a time, since it does have that 4-second immunity period. So to summarize, when would be a good time to use Kjolnar's Nightmare? No one else is using it, and single target damage is the highest priority. Alright, next up is Selene. This one is from Selene's Web. The one piece adds maximum stamina, and then the two piece, when you deal martial melee damage, you call upon a primal spirit that mauls the closest enemy in front of you after 1.3 seconds for physical damage. This effect can occur once every 6 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. So this is another really nice set for single target damage. A lot of people think the bear is AoE, but it actually only targets one enemy. It hits really hard though and has a short cooldown with a guaranteed proc condition. It does have a line of stamina on it though, so it is slightly more useful on stamina stacking builds than magicka stacking builds, though it could definitely be used on both. You do need to be running melee weapons though to get the most out of this, to make sure that your light attacks are triggering it. You could use a specific ability to trigger it with ranged weapons, but uptimes would likely not be very good. Light attacks from two-handed or dual-wield weapons work perfectly though, since you are weaving those in between your abilities anyways. So to summarize, when would be a good time to use Selene? Stacking into stamina, single target damage is the highest priority, and using melee weapons such as two-handed or dual-wield. Alright, next up we'll go through some sets that deal AoE damage, or at least partial AoE damage, but AoE encounters are not necessarily their focus. Still usually best for single target fights, they just have the added benefit of also dealing some extra AoE too. First up we have Zon. This is from Scalecaller Peak. The one piece gives crit chance, and then the two pieces, when you deal critical damage with the light or heavy attack, you have a 33% chance to tether to your enemy for 10 seconds, as long as you remain within 8 meters of them. Enemies touching the tether take flame damage every 1 second, increasing by 100% per tick, and are afflicted with the burning status effect. This effect can occur once every 20 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. So this is currently the most popular monster set for fights where you can keep that tether going, and this is why you commonly see it as the top performer on trial dummy parses. The proc condition is pretty erratic. First you have to land a critical strike with your light or heavy attack, and then you have a 33% chance to proc it from that. So RNG on top of RNG. Not a super reliable proc condition, but over the course of a longer encounter, again such as on the trial dummy, it will generally even out to produce good results. But there is also that 8 meter tether condition, along with the 10-second build-up time to reach its maximum damage ticks. So if that beam does proc at the wrong time, you're kind of out of luck. The flame damage from the tether is pretty good damage, though it cannot crit. It is one of the few sets in the game that is unable to, but the damage is cranked up pretty high, so as long as you are getting that full duration and you're getting the max ticks on it, then it still does really good damage. But that damage alone isn't enough to make it as popular as it is. It's really that damage plus the guaranteed burning you get with each tick that pushes it up to that top tier. It does also deal damage in an AoE to anything touching that tether, which was part part of the changes they made to this set in the High Isle update. It used to be a single target only option. So if you do have other enemies touching that tether, you can get some AoE damage from this set as well. And one more thing to note, this does seem to now be working on the dragons in Sunspire, as well as the final boss in Dreadsail Reef, Teleria. It seems that ZOS has fixed those, and I guess it's with how the hitboxes interact with it that has been resolved. I honestly thought this would just be one of those things that never worked, but people are reporting that it does now. So to summarize, when would be a good time to use Zon? Whenever you can reliably get all 10 seconds worth of ticks from the tether, so low mobility fights, and also fights without a lot of immune phases, or at least a long enough period between the immune phases where you can reliably get these ticks off. Pretty much, since the damage from this is so backloaded with the ramping 10-second timer, if you aren't able to reliably get those late ticks, you probably won't see great results from this. If you can though, it's one of the best monster sets to use in the game. Alright, next up we have Narayaneth. This is from Crypt of Hearts 2. The one piece adds 129 weapon and spell damage, and then for the two piece, when you deal direct damage, you have a 15% chance to summon a Lich Crystal that explodes after 2 seconds, dealing magic damage to all enemies within 4 meters. This effect can occur once every 3 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. So this one does deal AoE damage, but it isn't in a huge area, so typically it's still a single target focus sort of set, but you do get to benefit from some AoE damage from it. It has an extremely short cooldown, only 3 seconds, which if you could get it to reliably proc every 3 seconds, it would be the strongest monster set in the game. However, it does only have a 15% chance to proc from direct damage, so this would be your light attacks, spammables, or other abilities that have a direct upfront hit to them before their dot is applied. This does mean there is usually a fair bit of downtime added onto that 3-second cooldown. However, if you are dealing a lot of direct damage, typically if you're using a multi-hit spammable such as Force Shock and its morphs from the Destruction line, the Templar spammable Puncturing Strikes and its morphs, or the dual wield spammable Flurry, these all hit multiple times within a 1-second global cooldown period, meaning you have extra chances to proc Narayaneth that you wouldn't get with just a standard one-hit spammable. So in those scenarios, Narayaneth actually jumps up to one of the better options to go with. It is worth noting that it has lost a little bit of oomph recently on Templars since their execute got buffed up a lot, and that's because you often are starting that execute phase now around 40% health remaining and you're no longer jabbing at that point. Whereas this phase used to not start until like 20% health or so. So just something to keep in mind there. To summarize, when would be a good time to use Narayaneth? If you're using a multi-hit spammable and you don't need a large AoE of cleave damage from your monster set. Alright, next up is Maw of the Infernal. This is from Banished Cells 2. The one piece adds maximum magicka, and then for the two piece, when you deal damage with a light or heavy attack, you have a 33% chance to summon a fire-breathing Daedroth for 15 seconds. The Daedroth's attacks deal flame damage every 2 seconds. The Daedroth can only be summoned once every 15 seconds, and its damage scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. So this does have a magical line for the one piece bonus, so not the strongest there compared to other sets that get crit chance or weapon and spell damage. However, the Maw itself that is summoned is very strong, dealing quite a lot of flame damage. It's a pretty solid option on any class really, though generally not the very top option, except for on sorcerers. They have a unique interaction with the set due to their Daedric Prey ability, which buffs the damage from pets by 45%. This is a pretty hefty boost to a set that is already pretty good anyways, and definitely seems to be the top option for single target damage for sorcerers. Now, the Maw does have an AoE attack, but it doesn't seem to account for too much of the total damage that it deals, and the main focus of this set is really the single target damage to your main enemy that you're attacking. So to summarize, when would be a good time to use Maw of the Infernal? If you're playing on a sorcerer using Daedric Prey and single target damage is your main focus. Next up is Stormfist. This is from Tempest Island. The one piece adds stamina recovery, and then for the two piece, when you deal damage, you have a 10% chance to create a Thunder Fist to crush the enemy, dealing shock damage every 1 second for 3 seconds to all enemies within 4 meters, and then physical damage when the fist closes. This effect can occur once every 8 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. So we have an easy trigger condition here, 10% chance on any damage, and it has an 8-second cooldown, so it will be going off pretty often, pretty close to on cooldown if you have some dots ticking. Stormfist actually has the strongest proc of any of the monster sets in the game in terms of just straight up DPS potential. The shock and the physical damage added together are pretty amazing, but there are some downsides. First, the one piece bonus being stamina recovery. This means that you are giving up some damage there compared to other options you might go with. Comparing to an option with a Magicka or Stamina line, it isn't much, maybe a 1% difference, but comparing to a set with a crit chance line, it's closer to the 2.5% range for the damage loss there. So just want to mention it because it's something that can't be ignored when looking at how strong the proc itself hits for. It's still a really good set, don't get me wrong, and stamina recovery can be useful for some setups too, so it isn't always a dead stat line by any means. The next issue that it has is that since it will proc with any damage dealt, you can often run into the scenario where it procs off of one of your dots on an enemy that is outside of the main stack. And so essentially you're wasting one of your procs on a side ad that would have just died to cleave anyways. However, when you can get it to reliably proc on your main target, the thing hits like a truck. It does have a 4-meter radius for AoE as well, so it ends up being kind of a mix between the single target and AoE DPS category. If stuff is stacked up tightly enough though, it can definitely do some really good AoE damage. So when would be a good time to use Stormfist? Stam recovery would be a beneficial stat to your loadout. You need something that can handle both AoE and single target scenarios, and you can reliably get it to trigger on the desired target. All right, shifting gears a little bit here. Now we'll go with some options that are a bit more focused into dealing AoE damage as their primary function. First up, we have Velodreth. This is from Cradle of Shadows. The one piece is weapon and spell damage, and then the two pieces, when you deal damage, you have a 20% chance to spawn 3 disease spores in front of you after 1 second that deal disease damage to any enemy they hit. This effect can occur once every 8 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. So how this set works is that there are 3 spores that shoot out from your character, one traveling straight, one angled to the left, and one angled to the right. However, only one of the 3 spores that shoot out can hit each enemy, so you can't get them all to hit at the same time, even on a larger boss like you used to be able to years back. So once an enemy is hit with one, they are immune to the other 2 until the 8 seconds is up, and this can be triggered again. So for single target scenarios, this is going to be an okay option, but outclassed by a good number of the other sets. However, one of the great changes that they made to this set back in Update 31 is that this set's disgusting spores no longer explode after hitting a target and instead now continue to travel in a straight line. So it used to be that once a spore hit an enemy, it exploded, and so this set had a cap of 3 enemies that it could hit. Now that the spores continue on, they've effectively lifted the target cap, and you can hit as many enemies as you can get this to actually go through. And so this set is now all about positioning. If you're standing far back at range, you likely aren't going to get a whole lot out of this due to the trajectory of the spores. The middle one will probably hit, but the 2 side ones are likely going to be too far out of play to really be reliable. However, if this is triggering while you're up in the thick of it, it is really likely that you can hit all of the enemies stacked up with your 3 spores. And in those kinds of scenarios, Velodreth does really good damage. The proc condition is also pretty easy. It's only a 20% chance, but it's on any damage, so it pretty much fires on cooldown once your dots are all applied. So again, situational, which has really been the theme of this video. So when is a good time to use Velodreth? AoE damage is your main focus. You're playing up close to the enemies, or you don't want to change gear around for different fights and you want a set that does okay single target damage and really good AoE damage. Alright, next up is Prior Theeric. This one is from Red Petal Bastion. The one piece adds 129 weapon and spell damage, and then for the 2 piece, dealing direct damage with an area of effect ability creates a 6-meter shadowy whirlwind beneath your enemy for 7 seconds. Enemies within the whirlwind take physical damage each second and increase their damage taken from your AoE abilities by 5%. This effect can occur once every 15 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. Many of the sets we've gone through have been situational, but this one even more so, as it's really not too great averaged out over a longer encounter. With the proc only lasting 7 seconds and the cooldown being 15 seconds, we don't even have 50% uptime on it. But for short burst scenarios, the damage from the proc paired with the 5% boost to all of your AoE damage is actually really strong. Anything under 10 seconds or so, and this can be a really good option. Another nice thing about this set is that since it triggers from dealing direct damage with an AoE ability, you can place it exactly where you want depending on the skills that you're running. For example, on a DK, I could use my Eruption ability, or on Templar, I could use my Blazing Spear to point it right where I want it to go off. It can be really nice for scenarios where you're comfortable with your group and you know exactly where the stack points are. So the biggest downside of the set is really just that long cooldown. To summarize, when would be a good time to use Prior Theeric? General short burst AoE scenarios, specifically if you do know the stack points. All right, next up on the list is Ice Heart. This is from Dire Frost Keep. The one piece adds crit chance, and then for the two piece, when you deal critical damage, you have a 20% chance to gain a damage shield that absorbs 5,000 damage for 6 seconds. While the damage shield holds, you deal frost damage to all enemies within 5 meters of you every 1 second. This effect can occur once every 6 seconds, and the damage scales off the higher of your weapon or spell damage. So Ice Heart actually does really nice AoE damage. Even for single target, it's not too far off from some of the heavy hitters like Kjolnar's and Zon. And on top of that, you get a nice damage shield each time that it procs as well. Definitely a really good option if you need a little extra survivability. Really, the two main downsides are, one, it has a short range, only 5 meters that's based on you, so you do have to be in melee to get that damage from it. And then two, that damage that it deals relies on the shield being active. So if Ice Heart procs and then 1 second later you take a hit that eats your shield, you won't be getting any damage from the set until it's available to proc again after that 6-second cooldown. So just something to keep in mind when you're using this set more for the damage side of things. But to sum it up, when would be a good time to use Ice Heart? For survival, you want to play a little bit safer, or a well-rounded mix of damage and survival. You're playing in melee range, or you want something that's going to be a solid choice for a good variety of content. All right, finally for the two-piece monster sets, we have Balorgh. This comes from March of Sacrifices. This one is a bit unique in the way that it functions. It adds 129 weapon spell damage for the one piece, but the two pieces, when you use an ultimate ability, you gain weapon and spell damage equal to the amount of total ultimate consumed, and physical and spell penetration equal to 23 times the amount, and it lasts for 12 seconds. So at 500 ultimate spent, you get 500 weapon and spell damage along with 11,500 penetration, and this lasts for 12 seconds. It's so good for bursting down AoE trash packs or even for shorter boss fights in dungeons. It doesn't necessarily have to be an AoE scenario. Just a ton of stats, but it does require you to get to 500 ult to max it out, and it does only last for 12 seconds. So definitely want to make sure the encounter isn't going to linger on, as it falls off pretty hard after that initial opening. And even at only 250 ult spent, that's still 250 weapon and spell damage and 5750 penetration. But ideally, you build it up as high as possible before using it. I really like to pair this with mechanical acuity and go full medium armor for some encounters that I really want to blow up quickly. Since acuity will take care of all of our crit chance for a short period, then the medium armor will not only give us a lot of crit damage, but boost the weapon and spell damage that we get from Balorgh even further. And then we don't need the pen from light armor, since Balorgh is covering that part too. So we're pretty set on all of our stats with the Balorgh plus acuity combo. Can be really, really strong, especially if you're having multiple people run it. Those troublesome ad waves will just get obliterated. So to sum it up, when would be a good time to use Balorgh? Short burst scenarios, both AoE and single target, and if you have a high cost ultimate ready to cast. It's probably not quite as relevant for PvE on console without add-ons to change to different gear setups, but it's definitely a setup I make sure to have put together for most trials to use in at least one section or another. If you didn't want to change sets around, you could just take the DPS hit on the trash waves for some dungeon runs if you wanted to leave it on through the trash waves and build up your ult to dump on the bosses to just nuke them down. But it's nice to swap it in and out if you can. Alright, so those were my top 10 monster sets for DPS in the game. Again, those were not ranked in any particular order. These were all focused on when you'd be using the two-piece bonus though, so I did want to quickly cover those scenarios where you might only be using a one-piece monster set. So as an example, maybe you're backbarring an arena set and using a mythic and you only have that one piece left over. Generally, the top option for damage is going to be a one-piece slime crawl. This is because at 771 crit chance, it does have a smidge more than you'd normally get for a one-piece set. Usually you'd get 657 crit chance, and this isn't really a huge difference, about 3.5% crit chance instead of 3%, but hey, it's still a little bit higher, and it's pretty easy to pick up from Wayrest Sewers 1, so might as well. And then the other popular option for a one piece is to go with one that has penetration on it. This can be a little stronger than Slime Crawl, assuming that we are under the penetration cap and fully benefiting from that one piece bonus. The easiest option to pick up would be Krog, as that's from Fungal Grotto 1, but there are several options in the game that have that same penetration bonus for wearing the one piece. So maybe you want to flex on them with a one piece Lady Maligma. And then finally, a few honorable mentions. Not bad sets, but couldn't quite get them into that top 10 category. Doma House, Grothdar, and Alambris can all be pretty decent for DPS as well. Doma House mostly for fat bosses, where you can not only stand in the ring for your own weapon and spell damage bonus, but also have that ring damaging the enemy. Grothdar for very short burst AoE scenarios. It only lasts for 5 seconds before a 5-second cooldown begins. And then Alambris can have that same issue that Stormfist has, where it doesn't always proc where you want it to, but it is fairly good DPS if it's in the right spot. Also, an interesting fact about these, they can all be boosted by the Elfbane set, so if you're messing around with some interesting combos with Elfbane, these will all benefit from it for some unique interactions there. And then Baron Zadris can be pretty fun for building ultimate really fast in the right sort of setup, but in most cases that won't net you a DPS gain. I've had some fun using this with some barrier spam builds before, and it got some pretty hilariously good results. And then finally, Encratis is usually best for a support to wear, but if you don't have room for it on the support, you can have a DPS run it as well to boost the group's damage. Alright, I hope this video left you a bit better informed on when and where to use some of the top monster sets in the game for DPS. I'm sure I missed somebody's favorite set out there, so let me know in the comments if you think there are some that I should have included in with these. But that's going to do it for this one. Thank you all for watching, and a big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. If you'd like to help support this channel and the website, maybe consider joining one of those. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nalandia, Florian, Fedridi, Cha-Cha, and Unemployed. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.